Oh, welcome everybody to this webinar on searching for the soul and finding self. My name is Carrie Arnold and I'm the new coaching program director for the evidence-based program at Fielding. And this is my first webinar that I get to host. I started my position last month and I'm really excited about this topic. I have devoured Anne's chapter in the innovations book that Fielding just published over the summer. And let me share a few words about Anne, and then I'm just going to let her take it. She's got some great content in store for us. Anne is an executive coach who works across the globe. She's written a couple of books. And what's fascinating about her work is how she focuses on appreciative coaching. And I think that's something that we're all interested in as coaches. And so I'm excited for her to share her research. And she's got some new stuff. Like, that's the thing I think that's interesting, is that she's providing something that perhaps I've not heard framed quite the way she's framed it. So Anne, welcome, and we're very excited to have you here. This session is recorded. It'll be available to those who didn't get a chance. And for those who are here on the line, it looks like we have about 22 people. I am happy to take your questions, and just make sure you keep yourself on mute, dump those into chat, and there'll be a couple different times during Anne's presentation where we can pause and get your voices heard and make sure your questions are answered. So I'm going to put myself on mute, and Anne, it's all yours.
All right. Thank you very much, Carrie. I'm very delighted to be here, and it's wonderful to have so many people show up. That's great. I also want to point out that my colleague and co-author is also here. Her name is Jackie Binkert. So all the books that I've written, has been a co-author as well. So she's here as moral support, but I'm presenting our journey together. So in our chapter that we wrote is really in this presentation is about an updated definition of self as instrument. So, and really we're thinking of going beyond the idea of use of self, because we think self as instrument is much of a more accurate and contextual way of talking about the interaction, the mutual interaction between a client and coach, or any practitioner and client. So, and because when we do work together, basically we show up, right, as the coach or practitioner. So we are what we are. And so you'll see that we're going to build on that in this chapter about why we think that's so important. So I'd like to start off with what we hope are going to be some learning takeaways for you. I'm going to talk a bit about the emergence of the new science of positive human change, which of course appreciative coaching comes from. And then really hoping that you recognize the significance of the unconscious existential beliefs that we have as coaches and practitioners, and that our clients have, and that we bring together when we are, working. And then also understanding how theory influences who coaches are, thereby influencing how they coach. So you can't really get away from your existential beliefs, and especially your unconscious ones. And then again, as I said earlier, shifting from the use of self to self as instrument. So as I go through this presentation, I'd love it if you would just think a bit about what you really believe about the capacity for people to change. I mean, what do you truly think? And how about for you to change? So really kind of think about that. What do you believe about change? How deep does it go? And what about the way that you present yourself? So your stance as a practitioner and coach would help you be someone who could ignite positive human change, and perhaps at a deep level for your client. And then what are you aware of in your approach that relates to moving energy? Because that is something that I'm going to be talking about. So I'll begin with the journey that Jackie and I have taken together. So we started as Fielding HOD students in the late 80s. We graduated in the mid 90s. So like all Fielding students, we learned at that time that we were the instruments for change. And for some reason that struck me very deeply. When I got that concept, I realized, oh, it's however I show up, whatever I have done so far in my life, what my beliefs are, what my feelings are, this is what I bring. And then close to that time, I also had a child, and as I was raising her, I realized the impact that that children literally pick up who we are, less than what we are. So all of that was very significant for me. So we also did kind of different dissertations. Mine in particular, I did a hermeneutic and phenomenological study of time, a holistic concept of time. And as a result, I went a lot into that literature. And then Jackie did a dissertation on the impact of existential beliefs on group performance. So we got our PhDs, we went on, we did HOD work. And then around 2005, we were invited by another coaching graduate, Sarah Orm, to do some research about taking the principles and stages of appreciative inquiry and seeing if they would apply to a one-on-one coaching relationship. So we did that research, which resulted in, a model and then a book that came out in 2007. And then Jackie and I went on for a good 10 years to do international training and presentations. And during that whole time, we were very much drawn to process and generativity and energy-based foundations, because as we were going through and talking about appreciative coaching and building on our systems perspective from OD, we just felt this disconnect when we looked at the traditional mechanistic theories and what we were truly experiencing, especially as we were modeling and doing appreciative coaching. So through that time, we also realized for ourselves first, and then for others, that, what is our stance? What is our true beliefs about how people change? Because the appreciative approach is a generative approach. And when we got our PhDs, HOD, it was still based on a problem-solving approach. So literally, the metaphor for the organization was a problem to be solved. Whereas this appreciative inquiry, appreciative coaching is a very much different generative approach. You don't begin focusing on what's wrong, you focus on what's right. So that really changed us quite dramatically over a period of time to realize that what people's beliefs were was very significant. Because as we did workshops and presentations and coaching, we realized it made a big difference, and that a lot of the people that showed up as they were already coaches and they were, would-be coaches, that they had very problem-solving unconscious beliefs about change. So that became more and more important as we moved forward. So that first part of the journey. Second part of the journey was in finding self. So after we were, the Appreciative Coaching book came out, and then we were doing workshops and presentations. We had our own coaching businesses. We did a second coaching research project on about igniting substantial change. What occurs, what role does a coach play? And that resulted in a book called Pivoting, A Coach's Guide to Igniting Substantial Change, which came out in 2017. And then all that we discovered, and that seemed to really confirm and further substantiate what we were already doing with appreciative coaching, but at a much deeper level. So then, and by this time I was mostly doing the presentations and workshops, and I began weaving all of those findings into the training that I was doing. So the three things we discovered in this journey is kind of unfolding for us are three areas in coaching where we think beliefs differ dramatically from the mechanistic to the generative. And so that's what I'm going to talk about tonight. The first one is how one defines self. The second one is how one defines life in motion. And the third one is how one understands the movement of meaning making. Because we feel that after all that we have learned and experienced and studied, that it really is a significantly different stance if you move towards self as instrument rather than use of self. So a lot of what I've been doing over the last 10 plus years when I do workshops is helping people understand this conceptual bridge, that we are moving from the mechanistic linearity perspective, where humans were considered objects, still are by many people. We're fixed, we're static, to this quantum self-organizing where life is generative, time is holistic, and life is living systems, and that they're always in movement, and it's a spiraling movement. So building this conceptual bridge became a really substantial part of how I did my coaching and how I did my workshops and training. So in the course of this time period, also all these incredible shifts were occurring, and a lot of them were moving all of science towards a more positive perspective of change. So literally that shift from mechanistic to self-organizing, a quantum perspective, and the digital transformation really helped drive a lot of that. The machine look at human beings to the more process look at human beings, that we were externally driven to internally driven, that from neuroscience that we have a negativity bias, and so how important it is to focus on positive emotions to balance that. Moving from that mind-body separation into embodied knowing, and then moving from linear time to quantum holistic time. So a lot of stuff was going on. And so this is just a list of the different individuals who contributed to building this generative positive science. So beginning in the 60s with Milton Erickson, who inspired solution-focused therapy, obviously social constructionism, appreciative inquiry in the 1980s, positive organizational scholarship, 1990, and then Barbara Fredrickson's seminal article on what good are positive emotions. So then she went on to do 30 years of study of positive emotions, and then our own edition with Appreciative Coaching. So we really began to build and see the importance of we are the instrument, and so we really focused in on what are your beliefs. And there's been much written about this, and I know that most of you, are well steeped in all of this. So, but we began to incorporate a lot of this into our coach training, and also with the clients that I worked with, was knowing that you have a lens and filter on the world depending on your belief system, and that much of your belief system is at a non-conscious level. And that some scientists say as much that we behave congruently with what we believe 100% of the time. And then the whole idea that beliefs direct attention, so they are attractors, so we see what we believe. They're constructed over a lifetime. The deeper the belief, the more unconscious. And that if someone really seeks to change or shift at a deeper level, it involves a change in belief at a deeper level. So literally our beliefs impact how we engage in life. So I thought if you wanted to take a minute to just kind of play with this, this is a little activity that you can do to help clarify your stance about where you think you are on your beliefs about change. So you can just do it in front of you with a pencil, just note. So it's a continuum. On the left-hand side are different definitions of change. On the right-hand side are other definitions. There's no right or wrong here. It just, I think, might be interesting to see where you fall. So just put an X where you think you are on that continuum. I'll give you a couple minutes to do that. Maybe you can indicate via the chat that when you're done. And then we'll revisit this at the end. So.
Yeah, and I think you're good to go on.
Okay. All right, so the first thing I'm going to talk about is this concept of self and how that has changed. So one of the foundational existential beliefs that we began to see quite clearly was really, how does one define self? Because there's literature that talks about self as object, and then literature that talks about self as process. So really, beginning to think about where am I with that? What do I truly believe? And then in the research we did for this chapter, we found that self as object is embedded in many theories of developmentalism and the use of self-research as well. And a lot of it is defined that the self is an independent unit within a social context. So the self has a body, a mind, a spirit. It's shaped by the environment, but it is contained as a defined open system. So theorists seem to talk about self in this way as an object, an entity. Then there's research and theorists who seem to talk about self as process, that we have a self-transforming brain and mind that's open to change throughout our lifespan. We know that now from neuroscience. And that the self changes, arises, adapts, depending on the relationships and the situations it is in. So therefore, there is no independent existence. That self is relational and emergent, or self is process. And certainly Gestalt would be one example of this perspective. So we outline all of these in our chapter, but I'm not going to go into that detail now. But basically, this idea that there are two different ways you can look at the self, and in which way resonates with you and matches with your experiences. So here is a view of the two. So a more mechanistic perspective, so which is how we define it. Self as object belongs in the mechanistic. So self is a discrete object, and that we're matter also. And as such, we can be neutral. We can be onlookers, and we can remain unengaged because we're objects and we're separated from the subject. Or as subject, we're separated from the object. And also that from this perspective, if you are an entity, an object, then you have content and you have issues. Let's take a coaching client who comes in and they have a problem story, really, right? Almost all coaching clients do. And they want to talk about that story, and we help them try to understand that story. But the more time we spend on that story, the more mass or weight that story holds. So this is a belief that we have. Therefore, to try to move that mass and weight takes more effort. And the more we try to do that, the more resistance is created. Another view of this mechanistic self as object is that we can be neutral around the content of others. We can stay separate. We can maybe even be not judgmental, but helpful in that way because we can be neutral. And that finally, that we can kind of lead our client through observing, and we can witness, but that we're really not influencing them, or we're really not sharing any responsibility for the results of the coaching relationship. So that's a perspective of self as object. So we, of course, are more aligned with this quantum self as process. It seemed to match more the experiences we have. It matched more the appreciative and positive generative approach to change. So this perspective sees self as process indistinguishable from its relationships in the environment. So the self is dynamic and it's an energy-based being. So therefore we can observe, but we're always participating as well. We can't remove ourselves from it because we're part of the relationship of the self, coach to client, client to coach. Also, an advantage from this perspective is that if we are process, we can avoid going in the direction of adding to that weight or matter. Because if the person is a process, then we can help them reorient and shift their focus to a new story, to a solution, to a different way of looking at it, and spend less time on the problem. Because we know from an appreciative perspective, from the constructionist principle, what you focus on grows. So if we're focusing on the client's problem story, we are inadvertently growing that. And obviously that's not what we want to do. So this is the advantage of looking at self as process. And then being that we're in this mutual process together, we are in this context together. And so we are leading, but we're leading now as co-creators. We're participating observers of the reality, and we really share some responsibility for the process of the coaching engagement that we're in. So I think right here, I was going to stop and see if there were any questions, comments, feedback.
Yeah, and there is one question. One person asked the question, so where do challenges fall in the right-hand column? And if that question doesn't make sense, I invite Flavio to maybe unmute and ask it. But does that resonate with you of how to answer that question? Where do challenges fall in the right-hand column?
I'm assuming maybe they mean that we have problems. Obviously, we have challenges, we have problems as human beings.
Yes.
So yes, absolutely. If the appreciative approach does not say we don't have it, it's just what you do with them.
Got it.
So the difference with self as process is we don't add weight to that. We don't seek to inadvertently grow it and make it more, matter, solidify it, etc. So there's more resistance, so when I'm working with a client, if I've heard their problem story 3 times, then I will intervene. I will interrupt, and I will tell them why. Hey, what you focus on grows. So I'm shifting you now because you know really well what you don't want, but I want us to get clear on what do you want. So we try to lift the person up and put them into a future present, let's say. So you shift their focus.
And there's a question sort of similar to that. What do you do with a client who's extraordinarily stuck in his old story? How do coaches help them out of that weighted story into a new story?
Right. And, obviously it depends on the willingness of the client. So, we can only go so far. We can only go as far as the client is willing. But in most cases, I found it quite effective when I intervene. You let them say it at least 3 times. They need to be able to express it, invent it, and you're creating this relationship together. But then I come in quite strongly and I intervene and I say, this is why I'm not going to continue in this vein. And sometimes it takes you, I had one client, she had moved up to a high level in a government organization, and it took me like 3.5 to 4 months to help her change her language. Of every time I talked with her, everything was a problem. But every time she did that, I would say, hey, can I just point out the language you're using? And, this is what you don't want, what you want. And she did. She was one of the clients we had in our research who actually had an epiphany and was able to shift. So that's what I do. Anything else?
That's great. Thank you. No, so far, those are the questions. And I guess I just wanted to tap into what you just said. Language is so powerful.
Yes.
And since we don't think in words, once we express in words, sometimes it helps to have a new metaphor or a new language to describe it. So yeah, very powerful. Oh, actually, one question did just pop in. Is there a use to see the self as object neutrally to observe self as process and transform?
Have to run that by me again.
Yeah, so this is from Candace, and Candace, if I'm emphasizing the wrong words, let me know. The question is there a use to see the self as object? And then she has.
Is it useful in some way to see the self as object? Is that the
maybe? Yeah, to see yourself as neutral.
It's sort of, I think of self as object as a way of viewing the self neutrally in order to then be more of the process self. Be more of that sort of energy. So I'm wondering what the role of neutrality is in self as process.
So, I'm going to say here there is most likely a continuum, right? From this left to the right side. And so, I'm moving more and more on the right-hand side, the more, that I've learned and experienced, et cetera, to really realize, because we all are energy, that we can't really ever be neutral, that we show up with everything that we have. And I'll talk about it a bit as we move forward from a phenomenological perspective, is that we can't take away our prejudices or our preconceptions around language, or there's just so much of what we have that it just is. So just, accepting that and knowing that. So I think if that helps and seems to be working with what you're doing, I'm certainly not anyone to say that's not a great way to go.
And Anne, you might be getting to this in one of your future slides. It might be helpful to know how this relates to the evolving self in Kagan's model and framework.
Yeah, I am getting to that. Yeah.
I figured so. All right. Well, we'll let you
Okay.
go forward, and I'll keep capturing question.
Okay. So the second belief that we saw is quite different from the mechanistic degenerative is the affirmation of life as motion. And so we saw it, in our experiences and our studies and research, et cetera, that there really are some new existential beliefs out there. So obviously the most clear one is a quantum perspective, a self-organizing perspective, but also an evolutionary perspective. So I'm going to speak a little bit to the evolutionary one. And so there is, some theorists are venturing that we're in this evolutionary movement from a first tier consciousness to a second tier consciousness. And this second tier consciousness embraces more of this concept of self as process. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. So on 2 slides, I have a list of the theorists who support non-Newtonian principles that we have read. Also, when I did my dissertation on time, it was a phenomenological approach. So many of these theorists I had already been, well acquainted with in doing my dissertation. So here's just a list, just so you have this, because this PowerPoint is going to be available to you. And then more of them, Kagan, obviously, very key in all of this. And then the bottom 2 I'm going to highlight because I'm going to talk more about them. So one is the Transformative Phenomenology. One of them is our own Valerie Benz from Fielding, and Reinventing, hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. So they're taking their books where they talk about direct experience as a source of knowledge, and this deepening of embodied awareness that life itself is a process of transformation, and that therefore can be a way of knowing for us. And then the bottom on the developmental and evolutionary change theorists. So, I've got a number of them listed there, including a Fielding graduate, Wade. And so I'm going to build on that bottom one right now. So from the evolutionists, they take this historical perspective, obviously, and many of you may know this, so I'm just going to go through quickly, and obviously it's so simplified, it's ridiculous, but hopefully you get the gist of what I'm trying to say. So their perspective is that evolution occurs in these spiraling stages, and there can be sudden transformations and leap in abilities, and that, as Wilbur calls it, kind of flowing waves of consciousness. So it appears when we look out in the world right now that we are in the midst of one of those very big evolutionary waves occurring. And every time a new stage comes in, there's a different set of values, needs, morals, worldviews, etc. So I'm, grossly simplifying this. It's obviously much more intricate. And then the whole idea that this is like a embedded hierarchy, in that each stage is not better, but it's actually just a broader and more complex way of dealing with life. So if you look on the right-hand side, I'm going to go through the different stages of consciousness. Again, this is very simplified, but they assign colors to them. So red would have occurred about 15,000 years ago. And that the view of what life was, it was magical, the organization was tribal, the chieftain had complete power, ruled by fear, and kind of the metaphor is wolf pack. And then about year 4,000, or about year 4,000, the conformist amber wave of consciousness came in. So this was much more hierarchical, agrarian. It's when all the major empires throughout the world were established. So more formal, more command and control, and metaphor is army, empire. And this mode of consciousness is very much black and white. There's a one way of doing things and there's a wrong way of doing things. And then about the 1600s began this rise of industry, a machine perspective, and so it gave birth to this kind of what they call achievement orange. So science versus religion and mythology and industry, and then the focus being on profit, growth, innovation, obviously, you know, hundreds of years building on that. And then in our lifetime, for those of us here on the call, well, at least my lifetime, I should say, in the 1960s came the pluralistic green. So this was literally, you know, and anybody who lived through the 60s like I did, it was a very powerful movement. You know, moving us from more industrial to more the information age. It was about empowerment, and diversity, and equality, and ecology, huge there, hence the color green. And the metaphor family. So, you know, very powerful. And then now they are saying, these evolutionists, that a new wave of consciousness began around the 1980s. Now, this is also around the time when I was starting my PhD in the late 80s, and when there were all these books that were coming out about quantum physics and things. All these years later, that really something has developed in this area. So they're calling this evolutionary teal, and this is, you know, very definitely self-organizing. So life is led from the inside out. All the preceding ones are more the other way around. So that we adapt, that there's consciousness, that there were integral, and the metaphor is living systems. And so Frederick Laloux, who wrote a great book that came out in 2014 called Reinventing Organizations, he kind of summarizes this, and he talks about how every time humanity shifts, it seems to invent a new way to collaborate in a new organizational model, which if you look out there in the world, it does seem to be happening right now. So there is this momentum through evolution that's taking place. And so now with this emergence of the teal, because they're saying that, like, let's just say in the United States, that still about 30 to 40% of the people are amber. So, and that at any given time, all of these are existing in our society. But this arise of the teal one, this is, you know, about 2 to 3% of the people are beginning to show these kind of characteristics. And what they're saying that is so amazing is that they're saying that this is unprecedented in human history, meaning it seems to be a monumental leap in meaning. So with a focus on being values instead of doing, and that all these previous stages, the red, the amber, the orange, the green, including the green, and the green is very much OD principles and perspective are all very much embedded in the green perspective. That all of those still operate from a subsistence level, operating out of a sense of lack, scarcity, deficiency, and that each one of those still considers its point of view the only one. But apparently with this teal evolutionary stage, which is arising, it seems to be based on a different perspective, that there really is a sense of abundance in the world, that life has our back, that there's trust, that we're moving always towards greater complexity and more refined ways of dealing. So hence this difference between first tier consciousness and second tier consciousness. So a lot of us doing coaching, a lot of us working with organizations are organizations that are still very much in first tier consciousness. But some of us, you know, practitioners and clients are in this second tier consciousness. So I'm going to show you an example of this. So it was probably about 3 years ago, and I was visiting my colleague Jackie, and I had brought a chapter with me. I think we were preparing to write our second book. And it was a chapter that talked about this teal thing. And I don't know how I got the chapter or what it meant, but I read this chapter And as I was reading it, I remember looking up at Jackie and saying, this is me. Everything I read in this chapter was me. It's my thoughts, the conclusions I was coming to, as in my work. And I couldn't fathom how somebody could write about me. And then I realized, I am part of a movement. I'm just one of the people who believes in these kinds of things and sees it happening. So literally coaching is based on this idea of inner rightness as compass, so that we live from the inside out. That life is a journey of unfolding. Jackie and I, as we were moving our way through all of this in our lifetime, it was unfolding for us. We did not move forward with great intent with this. The whole appreciative perspective is very strengths oriented, realizing that life has adversity, it has challenges, we have problems, but how do we deal with them? Do we deal with them from a place of lack and scarcity and fear, or from trust, love, abundance? Valuing wisdom beyond rationality, that there are more ways of knowing than just a conscious mind. And we had already been talking about that in all of our training. Letting go of an overemphasis on goals and instead being able to listen to the life that wants to be lived through our clients, striving for wholeness, and then just realizing, I remember the moment when I realized that, oh my gosh, organizations are living systems of their own. You could take the people out, but that system still is living. So all profound changes that moved us to this idea of life is motion. So here's just, again, a comparison of the two. On the left would be the red, amber, orange, green, first tier consciousness. As we can see, very much that machine nature, space and time are separated. Linear, absolute time can only be incremental. This idea of mirroring, which is like we mimic and facial, but we're still separate, subject and object. And that we rely primarily with our cognitive or mental mode of knowing, as opposed to this new kind of second tier consciousness. Things are holographic, system orientation, multi-causal, that you need the power of disruption and interruption to break the client's kind of fractal patterns that they are stuck with. And that all change happens in the present. So that's where everything is happening. And that this mirroring is really so much a part of us, because we're energy, our clients are energy. So there's no way to separate us out. And then just recognizing we have these multiple ways of knowing. Our clients have intuition, we have intuition. We have somatic knowing, because our whole body is intelligence. We have instinct, direct knowing, etc. So any questions right now?
Not yet. No, I don't think there's any new questions, unless anyone would like to take themselves off mute and verbally ask something.
Because I can also go on to the third one, and then we'll stop. Then I'll be done, and we'll.
That sounds great. I do want to reply to one thing here that it just really resonates me, and that's this idea that we can break our client fractal patterns. That's a lovely way of framing that. The major thing we do as coaches is we create awareness in our clients, and sometimes we have to break things to do that.
Yeah. Yes, I really have become a firm believer in that. And there, from a perspective of quantum coaching, they even go so far as to say a client really only has one or two deep life issues, that's what they're dealing with in all different situations. That's their pattern. And so when we get them, this is just another outshowing of this same one or two fractal patterns that they're working on. So
lovely. Yeah, I would suggest going on, and we'll see what other questions surface.
All right, so this is the third kind of belief, unconscious belief that we think is, changed quite dramatically from mechanistic to generative. And that is meaning making as movement. And of course, one can't talk about meaning making without talking about Kagan. So this is based on, when we wrote the chapter, we drew from three areas. One is Kagan's spiral model of constructive development. The second is Benz and Rehorik's idea and of embodied awareness, lived experience, phenomenology, and then levels of hermeneutic understanding. So this comes from that whole phenomenological hermeneutic background of Heidegger and Gadamer, and that self as process and movement. So Kagan's spiral of movement, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, and I'm referring back to his evolving self work. So, and he, it's based, he says human being is activity. Human being is movement, is motion. And based on two major premises. One, this constructivism, that we construct the reality, same thing as social constructionism, what we say in the appreciative coaching, appreciative inquiry. And then this idea of developmentalism that I just talked about, in which systems evolve through different stages, and they go back and forth between stability and change. And his premise is that behind the form is a process. So it's always a process that creates a form, not the other way around. And the evolution of meaning for him is that the fundamental motion and the evolution of meaning is the fundamental motion and personality. So there's this emergence from embeddedness. It's a movement. Change is this movement. And that all meaning depends on relationships, somebody recognizing you. That clients are the creators, but they need somebody to witness it and be with them and support them. And he talked about what a privilege it was to be in the very moment when a client is making meaning before your very eyes. And then how important he thought it was for practitioners at that point to see only the person, not the stage they're in. And that they are at the moment, and that moment they are making meaning, and not to go to a place where meaning is already made. So I thought that was very profound of his work. So now talking about transformative phenomenology, the study of lived experience. And again, I had a lot of this when I did my dissertation. So from this perspective, time, history, they're much more fluid and creative. Things are not fixed. And that you really can't predict with any certainty, as the mechanistic approach purports to do. And that humans live in multiple perspectives of time. We have synchronicity, we have intuition, we have sudden leaps of insight, we have discontinuous change. And then that whole idea that we live only in the present. So when we go to the past, we do it from the present moment. We don't go into a box and pull the past out. So the whole idea, which they're now saying, is that we literally reconstruct the past every time we have a memory, because we live only in the present. And then, of course, from the appreciative perspective, we firmly believe that you create the future in the present. So whatever you're working on with the clients, at that moment, they are creating their future. And that lived experience, so the entire body is an intelligence. We have the brain mind, a heart mind, a gut mind, and that it's energy, it's movement. So therefore we can't be prescriptive about change. We can have principles, we can have, guidelines, guiding principles, but you can't really be prescriptive. And that transformative phenomenology is literally a way of knowing, meaning that you can't extract yourself from what you are studying. And I'm going to get to the third one, which is understanding hermeneutic levels. So this is, Heidegger, Gadamer, etc. So hermeneutics is a study of interpreting and understanding something that appears in personal experience. And there's always like a hermeneutic circle, a spiral where you go deeper to deeper and deeper to try to understand. And this is a beautiful perspective to take when you're helping clients to understand the elements that shape them, that are hidden, and that really require to be interpreted before they can be understood. So it offers a process that really deepens understanding of how clients can be open to revealing of their own inner process, because it's revealed. We can't make them do it. They can't make themselves do it. We try to create the conditions and do the priming, whatever we can, to, for something like that to happen, but it cannot be predicted. And then again, this importance of language, because so much of language is at its root unconscious. And so how we need to question things to really understand the true meaning. And that underlying a hermeneutic perspective is that every single person is unique and influenced by whatever their preconceptions are. And so it's very contextual. You can't really generalize. So this is Gadamer's movement of understanding. So, which he believes you go from the heart, from the whole to the part, and then back to the whole. And that involves three different elements. One is a level of understanding, and that is analogous to watching a wild horse from a distance, and then you try to describe its context and characteristics. So in other words, like working with a client, you're going to move slowly in spirals as you're working with them, towards them. You're going to start at a level of understanding. Then you're going to move to a level of interpretation, which is like actually approaching the wild horse and then observing how does it interact with other horses, how does it interact with its environment. And then finally, being able to get to the point where it's equivalent to actually getting on and riding the horse, which is really taking the risk to end up in a place where you couldn't control it as a practitioner, but you're working together with the client, as they move through their process of meaning making. And so the process itself is the guide, not either of the individuals. So in this horse analogy is courtesy of Verhoeven and Benz. So just reflecting on meaning making as movement. So the whole idea is that everything is in movement. So when we go from an appreciative approach, we are trying to help our clients see a more expanded and generative view of their situation. We know that we're energy, they're energy, and then we're in this together. So we influence them, they influence us, and we're both influenced by our present and future. And that there are these different levels of understanding that we can enter into with our clients should we choose to, and really make the most of this time of mutual influence. And that we really thought that third level of riding the horse that Gadamer talks about is really similar to Kagan's focus on when people make meaning in that very moment. So, implications for practitioners. So we believe using that, the heading of use of self seems to consider self more as an object. So we prefer more this idea of self as instrument, because you are this instrument of these existential beliefs, unconscious, conscious, and that your beliefs about life lead to the values you hold, and which in turn influence your behavior. So it's very holographic. So we are participating observers, we have influence, and we enter into this shared embodied present moment with our clients. So therefore we can't really be neutral and objective. And if you think of the Mobius strip, what's in is out, what's out is in. And so knowing that many of us as coaches, we're still engaging, as I said earlier, with organizations that are still kind of achievement orange or pluralistic green in first tier. And so we're just kind of offering the suggestion that if you'd like to consider moving to a second tier or quantum perspective of coaching. This is kind of, I think, my final slide here. So, which is really seeing yourself as an instrument where you are helping facilitate energy and movement, because we're dynamic, energy-based beings. Life's an evolutionary process. We are process. We're embodied in energy and movement. It's interesting to think when our clients talk how the words they use and the language being stuck. Meaning making is a movement. Coaching is a movement. Moving energy. There we are. So we believe that coaches do energy influencing and facilitating. So I'm going to skip past that for right now. So any questions? Comments, feedback would be great. Challenges.
And there's been some really appreciative comments, just your visuals and your analogies and your metaphors. So some comments just to show that people are really engaged in your content. But yeah, I invite anyone to take themselves off mute, or if you want to type it into the chat box, I'm happy to read it out loud. Such great content. It's been very engaging. So we do have one question here. With a client who's operating in higher order consciousness and a situation with the COVID-19 where there is no right answer, not sure what the question is, but there's an interesting scenario here. Curious, Anne, how you've managed to be in conversation with COVID and clients in those higher, oh, here's the answer. COVID-19, where there is no right answer, how do I help her frame the situation?
Right. To me, you know, this dealing with this COVID is a whole, I mean, it's an illustration of how we are at this more teal or evolutionary movement where this is a high level of complexity now and very individual as well as collective. I mean, it's very challenging. And so most of us, you know, we're just kind of moving into this teal consciousness and trying to figure out things as we go. So I think understanding that, you know, we are all figuring it out as we go. How could you possibly have a fixed solution for this? We haven't ever encountered this before in our lifetimes. So I have a number of clients I'm working with in their organizations, you know, the CEOs, and trying to get things up and going and helping them realize that there is no set answer to this. So there's going to be.
Yeah, so Anne, do you think that maybe this is something that can't even be framed? You know, we know there's not a solution. I wonder if there's not even a frame.
Well, I think there could be a framing in the sense that we're dealing with an incredible level of complexity. So if you just take the digital transformation, what's happening there and how it's, you know, and what has happened and how we're using that now. And so I think the framing is it's a techno-human framing now. It's highly complex. And how do we be able to deal with people at these multiple levels of consciousness? Because in the United States alone, we have all of those represented. So how those of us who are, you know, moving into the teal and trying to understand the teal, how do we find solutions that are holistic, that take into account all that's before us?
Justin made a comment, and Justin, happy to take you off mute. I'm not sure I'm going to pronounce it correctly, but the Sinafin framework is often cited. And I'm not familiar with that. Is that something you can speak to? It's Sinafin, C-Y-N-E-F-I-N, or Sinafin.
Is that the one of super sensitive people, or is that something?
Knephen. It's Knephen is how you pronounce it. But
Oh, thank you.
Say more.
Yeah, I'd love to hear more. We have just a few minutes if someone would like to say a little bit more about that framework.
Anybody? I didn't quite get what the framework was. It's
Shinfin.
okay.
And I think the framework, this is James Warner, the framework is four degrees of knowingness. It's a 2x2 matrix,
Okay.
the way I've typically seen it. So anyway, so people acting based on what they've known in the past versus moving to higher degrees of freedom in the other. There's some great YouTube videos on it.
Okay. Does it seem like it fits with evolutionary type framing? That evolution or?
It does. I think it's more mechanistic. But I think it's more mechanistic.
Okay.
For those who are interested, there's a link that was put into the chat box that Justin put in. Flavia is asking some really intense, deep questions, and this one probably requires a whole day to answer, but how do coach and client orders of consciousness support or hamper the coaching process? So in other words, can a coach someone in a higher order of consciousness than theirs, or can the coaching process be disturbed by a coach in a higher order of consciousness than the clients?
Right.
And in a minute, answer that question.
Yeah. So I think, as much as I understand it, I certainly do not claim to be any kind of a expert on this, that because it's embedded hierarchy, is that a higher level coach can coach people at the preceding levels, right? Because everybody has to go through all those levels, number one. So you have to go through the red, amber, orange, green. So none of us escaped that. However, it would be challenging, I think, for a coach who, let's say, made it to the green, but not yet, but the client was teal. It seems to me that they might not gel there, but those would be my thoughts right now. That usually you can go for the higher down, but not, because I do know as a coach, it's difficult for me to coach a client on something that I haven't also experienced. If I haven't had a deep shift of my own beliefs, how can I help somebody else do it? So.
Yeah, thanks, Anne. I think I would echo and agree with everything you just said. It's hard to coach up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, I really welcome any feedback, suggestions, challenges.
Yeah,
What
we
do
have
you think? Does it make sense?
Cindy is asking a question. What if there are no right choices?
So right as in, like right as versus wrong?
Yeah, Cindy, I welcome you to take yourself off mute and maybe add a little bit more context to that question.
Yeah, so what I finished typing it. What if there's no right choices according, in COVID-19, for example, a medical physician family, 2-physician family, children at home, baby on the way to be born any day, next week or two. So do we send the children back to school? They miss their friends, they miss the socialization, the schools are taking all these precautions. The kids want to be in school. I need them to be in school. We need them to be in school. But yet we send them back to school. What happens?
Right.
Yeah.
We're engaging in those trade-offs, right?
Right. And so there's really not a right choice or a wrong choice, or maybe not even a best choice. It's more about helping maybe her trust herself or something. But the problem is, there could be there's maybe potential, what if she brings home COVID to the family or the new baby?
Right. And then, depending on where a client is at, I mean, it can be helpful if they are kind of clear in this area, or they respond to it, is that you can often ask them, what does your inner knowing tell you in this situation? This is your situation. So there are aspects of you that can talk to you, levels of intuition that they can help guide you in this particular situation. So I've done that with clients who I realize or know that will be open to that.
Yeah, that's exactly where we went with that. Having her trust her inner wisdom, her inner whispers, trusting herself despite that her friends are telling her one thing, she knows what she really needs.
Right, exactly. And I think, that is kind of a demonstration of this teal perspective, right? This is kind of, the compass really comes from within. So it feels like we're kind of in an overall movement in that direction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I forget which one was the teal perspective. Okay.
That was the last one where it's the highest one so far. I'm sure there are other ones on their way or already here, but so it's the one that says whole, that you live from the inside out, that you tap into your inner wisdom. There are multiple ways of knowing. There's, when you can get the PowerPoint, there's a whole slide with a list of the teal.
Yeah, it was helpful just to hear confirmation of where I took her.
It sounds good to me.
Sorry to interrupt. I know we're at the top of the hour, and for some, they've already started to log off, but I encourage you to stay. And Anne, can you stay a few more minutes?
Yeah, I can stay a few more minutes, yeah.
Okay, great. Sorry to interrupt. I'll let you guys continue that conversation, and there are a few more questions in the chat box.
And let me just say one thing before we get off, is just, taking another look at this. Did you move at all? And you don't have to do that right now. I mean, you'll get the PowerPoint, but just, did you move at all in the course of what we talked about? Would be kind of, I think, interesting for you to look at. So, yeah, I'm happy to stay another 10 minutes and answer any questions or comments or whatever.
So Anne, I would just like to say about that last question, I think that a situation like this unprecedented situation we're in now invites us to regress to a lower level.
That's one option, yes.
Right. I mean, the invitation is there through the ego or through our pre-existing pathways of organize ourselves, and it's really yeah. And everyone, I think we just need lots of support, and we need to provide support for one another to stay in the teal and move beyond.
Right.
There wasn't. Oh,
Hi, it's Ralph. Perhaps my comment is a little too basic, but I'm just wondering about transitioning as you age, because I want to become more fixed as we age.
Yeah, that depends on the individual, because we are, and their belief system, and obviously the context in which they live, because I do believe that the design of human beings is to grow and develop throughout a lifetime. And now neuroscience is backing us up with that. There's neuroplasticity, the quantum perspective. We're energy, we're aspirational beings. We are not fixed, we're not objects, we're not machines. So yes, intrinsically, we are designed to continually move and change. And so if we are not, it's the weight of, the belief systems we're in, the different, pattern behaviors, the culture, the society, so many levels where we're at, and there's billions of people on the planet, or billions of different journeys. So we're not all going to look alike.
Anybody else that would like to just voice a question? And I know some of these questions in the chat box, and you'll have the opportunity to see later.
Okay.
But if anybody's still on that would like to just voice a question, I certainly invite that.
This is Lisa. Thank you for your presentation and insights. Also, right now as a time period, we talked about the ability of not being able to coach up, but so a lot of people are looking for answers about how to be more inclusive or how to mitigate bias at this time. And knowing that there isn't a set checklist, maybe how would someone approach coaching an individual through this process if maybe they haven't yet approached that process themselves and kind of encountered their own biases?
Yeah, well, I think a coach cannot do that if they haven't done it themselves. And there is adult identity theory, which is also very much in line with what I presented, comes out of South Africa. So self-identity theory, if I'll try to find it and I'll send it to Carrie, but that is a place to start as a coach if you need to learn to expand. It's all about expand. So one needs to expand their context, their thought, etc., in order to be able to respond to more complexity. So, fear contracts, those negative emotions come in, we narrow down. But if we can help ourselves and other people, this is a difficult time, but it's also a time of great potential, great opportunity, time to grow. So we can work on building up more positive emotions, then in turn we help build our clients and our own capacity for resilience, for change, just our sheer capacity. So positive emotions expand, negative emotions contract.
So, and for those who are still on, it suggests they're really engaging with the material. Would it be useful for you to just go ahead and say your contact information if people want to follow up with you by email?
Sure. I think I have it. Yes, sorry, I didn't put it on there. I can be reached by email. It's aclancy@clancyconsultants with an S.net. So sorry, I didn't have it on the slide. My cell phone is 406-670-9362. I do have a website, but it's currently under construction. I have a LinkedIn. You can contact me through LinkedIn.
Well, and the other thing for those who are still on the call, she has a blog that she's written on the Fielding's website. And so with all her contact information.
Yeah,
And
thank you, yeah.
And, you know, Anne, would you do me a favor? I just don't want to type it in wrong. Could you just go into chat right now and retype your phone number and your email? If you just open up the chat. I was about to type it and then I realized I don't want to get it in there wrong and
Okay.
mess people up.
Let me, oops, here, let me get out of this and then I can.
Yeah, if you stop sharing, the chat box comes up a little bit easier.
Exactly. Right. All right. So then, yeah, here we go. Okay. So. There we go.
Thank you.
So thank you all for showing up and having interest, and you know, please feel free to contact me with any comments, suggestions, again, challenges, feedback. You know, we're all in this together, trying to figure this out. So.
Well, just given the interaction, this was clearly material that resonated with a lot of people, and you still have 15 people just hanging out here listening to you. So that doesn't happen when people don't like the material. So I am going to go ahead and let Anne off the hook. I just want to say thank you to everybody who's here, and by all means, reach out to Anne. If you have questions for me on future webinars, you can contact me directly. You can find me on Fielding's website, carriearnold@fielding.edu. Have a wonderful night, everybody. And Anne, thank you so much.
And thank you, Carrie, so much. You did great support.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.